Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in this book one at a time and looking at Reti's analysis of these games. This is game number 11, where we are continuing to look at the games of Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world champion, and his opponent is Joseph Blackburne, an English chess master. Blackburne has the white pieces and Steinitz has the black pieces. The game kicks off e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5 and b4 going into the Evans gambit. We see bishop takes b4, c3 and bishop c5. In previous games we've saw bishop a5, and Reti comments that this is the better move because with a bishop on c4, after white pushes d4, the bishop is under attack and black is forced to take. However, with the bishop on a5, not only is this pawn, the c pawn, pinned to the king after d4 comes, but black doesn't have to take. They can just play d6 instead, defending the pawn. However, Reti comments that at the time, both new moves were considered equal. Blackburne continues with d4, e takes d4 and castles. It's not commented on in the book, I don't believe, but it's worth noting castles, d takes c3, this isn't just a blunder of the pawn, because we'll have something like bishop takes f7 check, king f7, queen d5 check, king e8, and queen takes c5, or king f8. D6 will push the queen away, and we'll have queen takes c3. And this was quite a well-known trap in the Evans gambit at the time, and it's still played by amateurs today. So it's no surprise that Steinitz didn't fall for it, and instead in this position played d6. We have c takes d4, forcing the bishop to retreat, because the pawns attacked twice and defended twice. Now, Reti comments that at the time of this game, the position we are seeing on the board now was thought to be the standard position reached after playing the Evans gambit, with the moves that were played were often considered the best moves for both sides. Now here we see knight c3, which is a seemingly normal move, completely natural move. However, Reti does comment that actually in the previous games with Paul Morphy, it may have been more likely in Morphy's time to see something like d5, just continually pushing in the center, attacking the knights, and trying to get more of an attack going. But instead we see knight c3, a bit more principled, developing as soon as possible. Steinitz continues with bishop g4, and Reti offers quite a bit of analysis on this position. So he first talks about the pawn structure, saying that white has pawns on e4, d4, and black has a pawn on d6. And white also has better development. White has the knights, the bishop, and his castles, whereas black has two bishops and knight and isn't castled, and is actually 2 moves away from castling at least. Now, white dominates in the center, and this is white's biggest advantage. Because white dominates in the center, white's more able to get their pieces from one side of the board to the other very easily. They've got a lot more mobility, whereas black hasn't. An example of this is the bishop on b6. It's attacking this pawn, and that's it. It's going to take a lot of moves to try and get this bishop anywhere else on the board. Now, because of that, white is free to try and attack on the wings. White has central control. Once you have the center, you can then attack on the wings. It's a common theme we see, and it's told very often. However, black doesn't have the centre. So they can't really be attacking on the wings because their pieces can't coordinate to attack on the wings. Like this light square bishop can't really help that much in any attacks on the queen side, and this dark square bishop can't really help with much with any attacks on the king side. However, all of the pieces in Black's army can coordinate to attack the centre, and that's what the position calls for. So this bishop g4 move pins the knight to the queen, which removes a defender of this d4 pawn, and that's why Steinitz played it, to attack the centre. The position calls for black to attack the centre and white to try and attack along the sides. Now, Reti also comments that white has quite a bit more space. Black's position is a little more cramped, and therefore Black may want to consider trying to exchange off some pieces to free up their position a little bit more. Now here, Blackburne continues with bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king and defending this pawn. It's removing a potential attacker. Now in this position, we have come across this position in a previous game, or at least a similar one, where Morphy's opponent played bishop d7, just abandoning the attack on the centre. But here Steinitz plays the very interesting king f8. And the goal of this is to continue the attack on the centre, unpinning the knight to continue to attack on the centre. That's what the position calls for. And Steinitz is trying to attack the centre above all else, including if sacrificing castling rights. Now here, we then see bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and bishop a3. Now white's almost completely developed and has full central control. So Reti comments that because of this, and white aims to push the pawns in the centre. Black's king's in the centre, so white naturally wants to open up the centre, open up the lines for their... Sorry, white naturally wants to open up the centre and open up and expose the king. And white's in a position where he can do this. And it's quite difficult to find a more natural plan than this. That's what the position calls for. Now, Steinitz, however, continues with his plan of attacking the centre. He takes on f3, removing a defender of this d4 pawn. And this d4 pawn's a theme throughout this game. And Blackburne takes on f3. The reason he takes on f3 is because after king h1, he can play rook g1 and dominate the g file, which is where the king will be. And Reti does comment that this is potentially quite a scary looking move, taking on f3 and opening the g file for your opponent. But Steinitz knows that the aim of the position is to attack the centre, and that's what he's going to do. Continues with queen g5, we have king h1, knight e7. And now here in this position, Reti comments that the pawn push f4 is now necessary to try and further the attack. You can imagine if Blackburne gets pawns on f4, e4 and d4, then these pawns are going to come steamrolling down the board very quickly. And there isn't really a whole much that Black can do. Black will be very much on the defensive here, and White will have a lot more space if he can get this f4 push. And that's what Blackburne plays for. He plays knight to e2, supporting this f4 push, and Steinitz plays knight to g6, adding another defender to this square. And now we see why the knight developed to e7 initially, because he wanted the knight on g6 to defend this f4 square and to potentially have a bit of a blocker unit for the g file. We have rook g1, queen f6, queen to d3, and king g8. So this king g8 move, once the king was on f8, the bishop was pinning this pawn to the king. Now the king's on g8. Any e5 pushes are a bit more prevented because black can simply take on e5. And Steinitz is also hoping to play h6, king h7, and therefore castle by hand and connect the two rooks on the back rank. Blackburne continues with bishop c1, h6, f4, and you see how bishop c1 was adding another defender to f4, king h7, castling by hand, and now f5. See knight e7, and now bishop to b2, lining up the bishop to the queen and to this g7 pawn, a bit of a focal point in this position. However, bishop b2 does something else as well. It also defends the d4 pawn. And here we can see that this d4 pawn is becoming quite a bit of a hindrance. It's got this bishop attacking it and the queen attacking it. And white's knight, if it wants to move, it if the knight moves from e2, this pawn would have hung. So therefore, white was almost forced to play bishop b2 if they ever wanted a chance of moving this knight. Now here, Steinitz continues with d5, continuing the attack against the centre and fixing this pawn here. We see f3, rook a to d8, and now knight f5, only made possible because this pawn is being defended by the bishop now. And now we see rook h to g8. The knight on f5, the knight on f4 was threatening to go to h5, which would attack the queen and attack the g7 pawn because of the rook. So Steinitz naturally plays rook h to g8, adding a defender to the g7 pawn. We see knight h5 anyway, queen h4, and now f6. And you can see how this g7 pawn is, this point here is becoming a very much a focal point of the attack. And it's also worth noting white is currently a pawn down. He played the Evans gambit and he hasn't really regained the gambited pawn just yet. But now he's about to win it back. We see queen takes h5, removing a attacker of this g7 pawn. F takes c7, and now rook to d7. And we're going to come back to this rook d7 move later on. We now see e takes d5 check, because of the queen opening up here. Interestingly, the move rook takes g7 check was missed by both players, and it's not really too surprising. It looks like it just loses a rook. Now obviously rook takes g7 will have e8 queen, but after king takes g7, rook takes g1, king to h7, then have I believe it's rook take. Oh, sorry, it's not rook takes. It's e5 check, king h8, and then rook takes g8 check, king takes g8, and e8 queen. Alternatively, if the king moved to h8, we'd see the very easy tactic where the rook takes on g8 and e-pawn queens. Now both players missed that. Blackburne instead playing e takes d5, but it's not really too surprising that both players missed that because it looks like it's just giving away a rook, and I guess that's the beauty of computers. They see everything. But Blackburne played e takes d5 check. Now we see g6. And now the g7 point is a little bit more defended, I think. Obviously the g6 pawn is now defended by this pawn here, and the rooks haven't really got an easy way to attack this g7 point. Now here, Blackburne plays rook a to e1, threatening to queen the pawn. And Reti comments that it looks like White's attack is unstoppable. It looks like Black is only just managing to defend. But actually, this isn't really the case. While Blackburne, the white pieces, was trying to find some beautiful combinations and did succeed in getting some beautiful combinations, even though they were defended against, Steinitz with the black pieces didn't really give up on trying to achieve the positional requirements of the game, in this instance dominating the centre. And he continued to try and dominate the centre, even in spite of having to defend constantly. And we see this with the rook d7 move. Rook to e8 may have been a little bit more obvious, because the pawn was attacking the rook while it was on d8. But with rook to d7, he reserves the option of playing this rook to e8 and therefore doubling up on the e-file and controlling the centre a lot more and controlling this open file once it does open up. And that's why here Steinitz played rook to e8, and that's why he played rook d7 earlier. He saw that he may want to play rook d7 and rook e8, and therefore reserve the opportunity to double up on the e-file. Now here, Blackburne played rook e5, but Reti does comment that after d takes c6, we'd have rook to e takes e7, and this would just be game over almost. Steinitz is just dominating the entire board. This bishop is eyeing up the weak pawn, the pawn's pinned to the rook, both rooks are attacking along this open file, and the queen is attacking its other weak point and attacking here, and it's also free to move all the way along the 5th rank. This is a dominating position for black now. So consequently, Blackburne doesn't take on c6, he instead plays rook to e5, attacking the queen. The queen moves to h4, adding another attacker to the e7 pawn. And now we see rook f5, and Blackburne again comes up with a beautiful combination. It's worth noting the rook isn't really en prise. If g takes f5, you'd have queen takes f5 check, which would hit this rook, and after this rook goes, the e8 rook is also under attack. And it's also mate in 8. It can be, I guess, a bit of a difficult mate to find. The simpler option would perhaps be to just take the rook and then queen the pawn. Although that wouldn't quite work because queen takes, queen takes. But yeah, the simple option would perhaps be to take the rook, but it is a mate in 8. And if we saw something like rook takes e7, another quite natural move, we have the brilliant combination rook takes f7 check, rook takes f7, and then queen takes g6 check. So king h8, queen takes f7, and now mate in 1's being threatened. After something like queen e7, it's the only move to really stop mate, queen e7 is, but even this rook g8, rook takes g8 is forced, and Blackburne will just pick up a queen for a rook and easily won position. And that's all after rook f5. So it's quite a tricky position and quite a beautiful combinations as well. Steinitz doesn't fall for it. He plays queen takes e7. And now we see d takes c6, rook d to d8, and bishop to a3. It's worth noting that white can't really occupy the e-file with his rook because Steinitz can just take it off after the exchange. Steinitz is just up a rook because the pawn was pinned to the queen here. But instead we have bishop a3 attacking the queen. We have queen to e6, rook to f4, hoping to go to e4 again to try and challenge the control of this e-file. Steinitz plays f5, refusing to give away the e-file, stopping this rook e4 move. And also, this c6 pawn is under attack. Now here, Blackburne plays rook h4, again finding another beautiful combination. If Steinitz played something like queen to take c6, then we'd see bishop to c1, threatening rook takes h6. And after something like rook h5, after something like h5, the rook would take it anyway. G takes h5, and then queen takes an f5 check. And this is now just mate in 2. After king h8, we'd have queen takes h5 mate. Well, mate after the queen comes. And we just looked at this. After queen to g6, we'd see queen takes g6 check, king to here, and queen g7 mate. That was all after rook to h4 if black chose to take on c6. Another option which Reti gives, a lot of players may simply try and force a queen trade with something like queen to e2. And the idea is, after this queen trade, this pawn is under attack twice and isn't defended. The pawn is pinned to the rook. White's rook is attacking down. White's rooks are attacking down here, but they aren't really doing anything useful. They're not really that active. And black's rook is attacking this weak pawn. This rook is on the open file on the 7th rank, and this bishop is eyeing down here. And white's pawns are just completely spread out. So this is 100% a one endgame for black. It'll be quite easy to convert this. So naturally white would not want to go for this endgame. However, there is a bit of a beautiful combination here. We'd see bishop f8, seemingly hanging the queen, and if Steinitz takes the queen, we'd see rook takes h4 check, because the bishop's defending, king to g8, rook takes g6 check, king takes f8, and then we could get a bit of a perpetual draw here. So even the queen trade doesn't quite work. So instead, Steinitz plays h5, just defending this pawn a bit more. We then see bishop to b2, adding another defender to this pawn. And now rook to d5, just covering this f5 pawn. So a lot of the issues with this is if queen takes here, then we would see the same combination as we saw before with the queen taking on f5. So Steinitz has to play something to defend this f5 pawn in order to free up the queen. So he plays rook to d5, defending the f5 pawn, and again threatening to take on c6. We see queen to c2, and now queen to e2, trying to force a queen trade. Queen to b3, queen to b5 again, trying to force a queen trade, getting into that favourable endgame we saw. Queen to c3, and now rook to e2, getting the rook onto the 7th rank. And here Blackburne sets one last trap. He plays f4, and the trap is bishop takes d4, because after bishop takes d4 we'd see rook takes h5 check, g takes h5, and then we'd see queen g3, and then after bishop take, so the threat here is obviously queen to g7 mate, and you see the bishop eyeing it, the queen eyeing it, and the rook eyeing it, and it's mate in 4 is guaranteed, except for the computer does give a drawing line with rook takes h2 check, queen takes h2, and then queen takes queen takes c6, and I think it goes on quite a bit, but you can't really expect them to see all these insane tactical combinations. Very likely would have just been a mate, because everything is focusing on this g7 point, and if Steinitz didn't find this rook takes h2 check move followed by this queen takes c6, it would have been mate. Both almost impossible moves for a human being to find. So that was all after bishop takes d4, which was the final trap that Blackburne set for Steinitz. However, Steinitz didn't fall into it. He played rook takes d4 instead. Now we see queen f3, and now queen to d5, and the queen is pinned, so it's forced to exchange. After queen takes d5, rook takes d5, the game is over. Black's activity is massive. This bishop is under attack, this rook is under attack, this rook is on the 7th rank. White's pawns are just completely spread out and very they're going to be taken very quickly. Even after something like rook to b1, after something like rook to b5, how are you going to save this bishop? And even after the bishop falls, you're going to still have a rook on the 7th rank. The position's completely lost. And so that's the game. That's game number 11. Quite a long game, a very tactical one. And we saw just how important a lot of the considerations of the centre are, how Steinitz was constantly thinking about attacking the centre. Even when he was still defending, he was still trying to attack the centre. And we also saw some very beautiful combinations from Blackburne. I was quite impressed with a lot of them, actually. But that's game number 11. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time for game number 12. Thanks for watching.